G'day guys. One of my subscribers asked me a question. It's a sort of a typical question that I always get in that regard. And she asked, you know, one of her professors because she's doing nutrition sort of studies, and one of her professors said that, well, these people may have been eating meat in the past. It didn't mean it was healthy for them and all that. And I go, what a bunch of nonsense. And I said to her, it's ridiculous. And it is ridiculous. Every other species on this planet, every single species has a species appropriate diet. You can actually do a carbon, and nitrogen test on them and see exactly what they're consuming. When you observe them in the wild, in a naturalistic environment, they eat exactly the stuff. You can put the same animal anywhere on the planet and it will continually eat instinctively the same stuff. So the whole notion is ridiculous. And then they'll say, oh, well, out of necessity, because of glaciation, we were forced to eat animal foods. We had no alternative. But originally we ate plants and all that. And I go, yeah, we ate plants as before we became Homo sapiens sapiens, somewhere way back a couple of million years ago, like 4 million or 3 to 4 million years ago. But since then, there have been a whole lot of evolutionary steps to Homo sapiens sapiens. So, there's been a lot of steps. There's no cecum there to digest the fiber. There's a lot of anatomical changes since then. We're not the same species as the one back then. So what are we, and even Homo sapiens, they're only been around for about 300,000 odd years, give or take, based on carbon dating. But prior to that, there was, Homo erectus and others, which were very highly carnivorous, because it was a glacial period that they were living in. And then they'll say things like, oh, well, out of necessity we did that, but, genetically our genes are more adapted to plants, because originally, millions of years ago, that's what we were. And I go, well, how can we adapt in the last about 5,000? Well, if we talk about tillage, we're talking about 5,500 years ago. If we're talking about before tillage, when we started, we were still hunters and gatherers and sort of using some grains in certain regions of the planet, the Yellow River areas like the Indus River and areas around what we would call modern day Iraq and the southeast of Turkey and the northeast of Syria. So if we talk about that sort of region where, sort of tillage started and that sort of agriculture that sort of spread throughout the world, grain-based agriculture, that's about 5,500 years ago, because tillage was about 3,500 BC. So prior to that, let's add a couple of thousand years extra for that transition, another 3,000 years. You're looking at pretty much 8.5, maybe if you're pressing it 9. So about 9,000 years at max. And you've got major genetic changes and adaptations to the new foods because they were so toxic. So you've got people like in the Han Chinese in China over the last couple of thousand years acquiring, endogenous production of choline at a much higher rate than any other population on the planet. 76% of them have got that capacity. You've got populations like in the British Isles, like the Irish and all that, who have got very low levels of conversion of beta carotene. And that's only a couple of thousand years. So, it defies belief that they can actually believe that you can actually have adaptations within a couple of thousand years to, you could say, modern foods and foods like, pastoral foods and all that. But somehow, you could be eating meat for millions and millions of years and have no adaptation. And it's awful. It kills you, So zero adaptation for food that we're consuming for millions and millions of years. But we've got brilliant adaptation to modern foods that we've only been consuming for the last couple of thousand years. Absolute nonsense. And even dairy, as an example, because I'll say, oh, well, we had plants before. Well, dairy we didn't have. And that only took a couple of thousand years to acquire some, like there's a calcium one thing that I have, 24% of people have it, genetics, where because a high consumption of calcium-rich foods like dairy in certain populations, you have a downregulation in calcium absorption. That only took a couple of thousand years. That's due to a consequence of dairy. You didn't have prior to that any, if plants was the normal diet, well, how come we know that vegans in particular are calcium deficient? They have problems. Well, if plants were the natural diet over thousands and millions of years, don't you think we would have acquired the ability to extract from plants calcium much better than we can at the moment? That should tell you something. We can do it from meat if you're not one of those dairy populations. And the only reason it got downregulated in those pastoral populations for the simple reason they were getting too much. So the body had to restrict the absorption, for those 24%. But for the rest of it, everybody else can extract more than enough from meat, which shows quite clearly that that's natural, but you can't do it from plants. So what adaptation? The adaptations are quite clear. The genetic adaptations, not having a cecum and all that, the ability to create ketone bodies, to produce from the animal fats short chain fatty acids and stuff like that, for specific gut microbiome adaptations to be able to utilize, proteins to produce short chain fatty acids that actually produce more. Remember that there's a video that Paul Mason did, which actually shows that quite clearly. I'll actually stick it up there so people can actually see it. And you can actually produce quite a lot of short chain fatty acid, more than on a plant-based diet. So, that's ridiculous. Even that argument is just nonsense. The reality is we are adapted to eating the flesh of animals. Simple as that. And some minor recent adaptations due to pastoralism or higher tolerance to plants. And we can actually see that. You don't see the Maasai, the Inuit, the Hadza, these populations, when they move to cities and they start consuming plants, they get very sick. They get more, severe inflammation in their bodies. They get higher levels of diabetes and a lot of other conditions, which shows quite clearly that only the modern day agriculturalists have adapted to plants, not those tribal people. And since we originate from those tribal people, what does that tell you? We're adapted to animal foods. That was our primary default food. Because those populations, if they were adapted to plants and plant only, they should go and they should be the most healthiest plant eaters on the planet. It's the complete opposite. All tribal people are the worst, and they've actually also got lower amounts of amylase that they can actually produce compared to people who've adapted over the last 9,000 years or whatever of agriculture that have got some upregulation of amylase to be able to process carbohydrates. These are sort of modern day adaptations. So the whole concept is completely and utterly in the reverse order. These people are just defying logic, or just normal, if you were to ask somebody who was completely ignorant of the field of nutrition and actually just lay those facts out, they would go, yeah, we're adapted to that, to animal foods. It wouldn't even be an argument. But these academics can jump through all these hoops. It's ideology. They've been brainwashed so severely, the cognitive dissonance is so high, they cannot escape that sort of brainwashing matrix that they're in. And that's the reality. You know, you sit there and you can't even have a proper conversation. You're not talking to a brick wall. You know, there is no logical. Yeah. Anyway, I thought I'd have a bit of a just a bit of a poke at the academia, the brainwashed academia as it is. Unfortunately, that's the sort of reality that a lot of people have to put up when they want to acquire, they want to work in a certain field, and they find it very hard because of the level of pseudoscience that actually permeates that field. But it doesn't surprise me, because it does make good money for the food industry and good money for Big Pharma. That is why they will continually push that narrative and try and continue brainwashing generation after generation after generation. This is all part of the plan, so to speak. And you can already see the push now using pseudoscience from this so-called environmental nonsense and all that. I mean, I've did a video ages ago that it's on Bart Kay's Odyssey channel, and I actually talk about the relationship between the carbon isotopes. You know, the ones from animals are actually declining in the atmosphere. The methane coming from non-animal sources is actually going up. It's the complete opposite. You know, reality is completely different from the propaganda, and that's the problem. The science can actually say things, and then we have propagandists which take that, distort it, turn it 180 degrees, and make something else out of it. It's like the Loma Linda study years ago, back in the 1950s. First of all, we know, because I've done a video that covers that. I'll put it at the other end, which is the one about Gundry and the nonsense. And he actually had to admit that it was 50% dairy, let alone the other animal foods that were in there. You know, that was a vegetarian diet of the 1950s. Well, not understandable. There was no refrigeration. You couldn't store, year-round carbohydrates. You only had certain types of carbohydrates available, you know. So fruit was only seasonal, honey seasonal, most things were seasonal, and even the greens, there weren't many green salads on that. You didn't have them all year round. That was seasonal as well in the spring. And for the rest of the year, you may have had rice and tubers, some grains and tubers. That's pretty much what, and at the same time, because people were much poorer back then and all that, they consumed far less. The cheaper stuff that was available was actually animal products, and they were more nutrient dense, and people knew that, and that's why they consumed them so high, and they understood the nutritional value. But obviously, because, you know, vegetarianism back then was very much dairy centric, egg and dairy centric, because obviously the flesh of animal was demonized, because the Seventh-day Adventists have a religious thing about the flesh of animals, and they pretty much that you could say really affected the way they perceived animal foods. It was more from a religious angle. At a latter stage, then they got into an unholy alliance with the food industry, and both of them, in particular, the food industry benefited from pushing that barrow in that regard. I mean, today's vegetarians are completely different from the vegetarians back then. And even then, that study actually showed the inverse relationship. Bart Kay actually did a video, showed quite clearly that the more people consumed animal foods, the better they were, rather than the other way around. So they even got the data. They actually, because they fabricated it, they did adjustments. We know what adjustments to raw data is. It's called fabrication, when you alter the outcomes by changing certain factors and modifying. No, you look at the raw data and say, this is an observation, This is what the raw data tells us, and that's it. And you don't say anything. You cannot infer anything from raw data. It's not experimental. It's just an observation. You have to do an experiment to prove that an observation may, that hypothesis of the observation may play out or may not. All you can say is so many incidents have happened, but to actually infer any causal inference, you really need massive orders of statistical sort of relationship, like thousands of percent, like in the tobacco studies, where the odds ratio is 10 to 30. The average is about 20, which is quite a lot compared to something which is below 2, which is 1 point something. That's, just statistical noise in that regard. So they are completely of no utility, but even when you look at them, they are very heavily animal-based, the vegetarian diets of the 1950s, which is the studies they always refer. I wonder why they don't do any modern ones. Because if you go to Loma Linda now, in those sort of areas, the rates of diabetes and many other diseases through the roof. You go to most of these regions, so-called blue zones, and all these foods of civilization, highly processed junk food, have come in and just trashed the traditional diet. So, it's a waste of time even going to these regions. You're not going to learn anything other than propaganda. That's the only value of them. Those traditional ways, these people had no refrigeration back then. You go to the Nagoya Peninsula down in Costa Rica, they are basically cowboys. They've got livestock. That's what they are. They're cowboys, So how many plants do you think they had? The only thing that they really had was a bit of seasonal fruit from a certain tree that grows down, that is sort of because it's a semi-arid type environment. So you don't really get many plants that grow. It's some fruit trees and a few things like that, and some nut trees. That's about it as far as plants go and what they had in their diet. Certain similar things that you get with a Hadza and people like that in this interglacial period, because they're available, and all food sources are valuable to a population that's got restricted access to food. Simple as that. And back then they did. So they'll have some of those seasonal things, but the primary food was coming from those animal foods that they were basically herding around the place. You go to Ikaria in Greece. Before the tourism turned up, we're talking about in the past, they were pastoral. That's all they had, goats and sheep and stuff like that. Primarily goats on that island. You go to a place like Sardinia, up in the mountains, they're all pastoral, sheep primarily, some goats, but primarily sheep. You go to, areas like Okinawa, what is it? Pig. They venerate the pig. They've got one of their own local pigs, and they undereat, which is calorie restricting the amount of food intake to about 80% till you're full. What is that? Yeah. Anyway, so it's nonsense. It's highly bullshit, on steroids that academia still regurgitates. It's like they got nothing else to do than be a mouthpiece for big pharma and big food. It's what it is. Grains and refined oils, they've got a good profit margin. That's why they produce them. And that is why they promote them, because it's good for business. So these academics, basically, beyond what they've been told and instructed from their governments to teach, because that's what it is, they can't think outside the box. Now they've got all these bean counters and bureaucrats that tell them exactly how to comply, how to be compliant with all the new rules, both in terms of gender and everything else under the sun. And so pretty much if you're not prepared to be just basically their little biatch and do exactly as you're told and all that, you're out. So academia has lost its value compared to the past. Can you imagine somebody like Atkins being around nowadays? He'd have lost his license a long time ago. You just wouldn't be able to function. It's a completely different, or Weston A. Price. He'd be probably put in jail. People like that, you know? It's ridiculous, but that is the sort of situation we live in, where unfortunately, a lot of people are they're not active in the society anymore. They've sort of given up. They're just sitting around, you know, playing their computer games or looking at nonsense like reality TV and all that. You know, the old bred and gladiatorial games of the Roman Empire as it was declining. That's a sort of situation we find ourselves in. And it's hard, you know, fighting against that, because everybody else has gone cuckoo. You know, I mean, you just have to look at the complete and utter debauchery. You know, Roman citizens were cross-dressing, were doing all sorts of crazy things. A bit like today. You know, that's the sort of craziness that existed back then as the decline was happening in the Western Roman Empire and going to crap. The one that survived for another well over 1,100 years was the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek one. They adopted orthodoxy, and they basically cleared the decks, cleared out all that filth, you know, and pretty much brought some sort of order to the society. Towards the end, they also fell into corruption, where their own leaders, the royal family and people around it started fighting for power amongst themselves and really weakened the empire. It didn't really start from below, it was from above. But the population still did not lose their faith. That's why they were able to survive and maintain their faith through all the tribulations that happened after that. It tells you, it's like even today, large parts of the Greek population is still Orthodox, is still people of faith, well over 90%. That tells you something. That tells you that when you have a society with strong values, and they defend those values, you know, are willing to defend them to the death, as many of my ancestors used to call out, orthodoxy or death, you know, and they were willing to fight for those things. It made the big difference and the survival, where most other societies have literally gone all cosmopolitan and all, you know, and now they've just gone off the reservation completely. That's what happens when you lose faith and you have this sort of nihilist, you know, atheistic sort of lunacy that we have today in the modern world. People gravitate towards very weird things, really weird things. Even on the spiritual front, they gravitate to this Gaia nonsense and all sorts of lunatic things. It's just what happens when a society it's lost its moral compass. And pretty much our modern societies are so corrupt now in every single field. You know, we've just gone to buggery. And that's why, you know, it's not a surprise to me or many others in our community that pretty much nutrition, everything else would go to buggery as well. So we're back before refrigeration in the 50s, we were consuming 2/3 of our diet was coming from animal foods. Now, only 1/3 or less is coming from animal foods, and we're sicker. And apparently the animal foods are the problem. I mean, you reverse the whole thing from 2/3 to 1/3, and the problem is the thing that you used to consume more in the past. Great logic. I mean, these people should be given a Nobel Prize for stupidity, because they deserve it, all of them. You know, it's ridiculous how you can have this level of cognitive dissonance when you actually lay it out to them. Here, look at this N15 data. You know, this is baked in the bones. Oh, well, you know, for millions of years, we ate something inappropriate. How stupid can we be as a species? And then in the modern era, we woke up to this reality, and we went back to our proper society type food. Kibble. Yes, kibble eaters out there. Yes, the future is yours, apparently. May the kibble force be with you. Yeah. One can only basically go to comedy to try and find some sanity in this world. It's crazy stuff. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this little rant of mine. Yes, Dad's getting better, which is good in that regard. Not bad for an old fella, 88 years old, 88 and a half. He's got 1.5 years to go until he gets to 90. For the last 10 years, he's been doing a high protein diet. He's been probably the last five-ish years, he's probably been consuming more protein than in the past. In the past, I sort of just got him over a gram, and he was also consuming a lot of leucine and taurine and things like that, MSM. He's still consuming MSM, he's still consuming taurine, he still isn't consuming leucine because he's eating enough. Now he's getting about 2 grams approximately per kilo body weight. So he's doing pretty well on that front. So yes, you know me, I'm around 2 grams as well. People may disagree with me. I don't give a crap at all. Pretty much the proof is in the pudding that you need more protein. I know a lot of people are concerned about sugar being converted to sugar. I think that's nonsense. When you can give a rat, which isn't even adapted to high protein, you can give it 70% protein and it still leans out like mad and becomes quite muscular and all that. Yeah, I think it's demand driven pretty much. And I think peristalsis, your gut motility actually slows down so you can absorb it over more hours. I don't really buy the notion that, I think if you do exercise and all that, yeah, it can go up the amount of glucose, but that's just demand driven again. Even if it's a small amount, it's not going to be a lot, because if it was a very high amount of sugar that was actually producing, people would have to explain to me why glucagon doesn't go to the toilet. Because if you're going to get too much glucose being generated by protein, then glucagon should go down quite a bit and insulin should go high, which means it blocks out the ability to use energy. Hormone sensitive lipase being upregulated gets downregulated. So you would end up with an energy deficit very quickly. But we eat a lot of protein with fat, no cheating, and we don't see that. We don't see ourselves having an energy deficit. But eat a bit of carbs with that meat, and immediately you can end up with hypoglycemia because you've shut out the ability to access fat, and now you're running out of sugar. So I don't really buy that notion at all. I think, yes, if you consume a lot of protein, maybe you get a bit of extra, but it's going to be so marginal, it's irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. You're still going to have sufficient glucagon temping down, you're basically, at most, you may get a slight increase above the baseline of insulin, slightly extra signaling, but it's not going to make a difference much, in particular because when we eat animal foods, we're also getting more taurine, and taurine has the ability to force pyruvate or to force glucose out of the bloodstream fast and into being oxidized. That's one thing. The next thing is it prevents it from actually getting recycling and going back to the liver. So it inhibits lactate production. It forces it through into the Krebs cycle. So yeah, and so when you eat real animal foods, and we're not talking about protein powders here, because protein powders are devoid of taurine. We're talking about real food now, eating steaks, extra meat and stuff like that. That's what I'm talking about. You should not see that. You shouldn't get that problem in that regard. So, and obviously, if you're having powders, you can definitely get more than at an absorption rate, which is probably higher, where with animal foods, you have to digest it. There's going to be, there's a whole lot of mechanisms in place to use it. It's a bit like rapid sugar. or certain things. It's going to come in too fast. So powders, possibility there, but powders are not real meat. There's a difference between one and the other. The other thing is, Dad being close to 90 impressed me quite a bit when the ambulance people called me and said, he doesn't want to go to the hospital, and go, what the hell's wrong with this? I ran over there. My heart was sort of pounding like mad. I was stressed out of my mind, and I was worried, oh shit, because he's close to 90. I thought he's probably just got a lot of adrenaline running through his system, but a lot of broken bones and potentially fractures all over the place from being hit, because he was a pedestrian walking across traffic lights, and legally he was on the beginning part, and this vehicle wasn't paying attention. 4-wheel drive came around the corner, hit him, realized that they'd hit something, slammed on their brakes. That sort of, Dad was going down, and sort of the momentum of the vehicle sort of was hitting him. It was like he told me, like, I got hit twice, and he got thrown about nearly 3 meters in front of the vehicle. So we're talking about a guy nearly 90 years old. He goes to the hospital, gets everything done, gets his arm in plaster. They are actually touching him there, and they say, because they thought he had a fracture in this part of the actual, because he put his hand out at this part. That was it, nothing else. But they misdiagnosed him. They put his arm in a plaster, and then after that, so he went home. 6 days later, we turned up at the clinic, at the Wellington Clinic in Argyle Street, and so the podiatrist checked him and said, I've checked it. I checked it. I actually got a senior person to check it as well, and we could not see a fracture. He was misdiagnosed, basically. And I said, yeah, well, look, when they were touching him there, you said he wasn't in pain. And she actually tested him as well, and she said, nah, look, it was just a misdiagnosis. He said, how old is he? I said, nearly 90. And I said he got hit by a 4-wheel drive, and he got pushed about 3 odd meters. And she goes, what the hell? Because most of them, can you imagine now, most of the people who are protein deficient and have got severe sarcopenia and severe osteoporosis, they would have broken hips and legs and all sorts of things. He escapes without even a fracture. Got it? Without even fracturing something. He gets hit by a car. He's nearly 90, okay? There's a whole lot of people out there that, are having sports injuries or having this injury or that injury or whatever. This is a guy 90 years old. So what's the difference? What is he doing different than every other Tom, Dick, or Harry in our community and beyond? Well, he's doing a couple of things. One, he's got similar genetics to me, so I've made sure that he consumes more dairy. So he actually has yogurt, cheese in the morning, yogurt in the afternoon, stuff like that. He has more. He has eggs, a couple of eggs a day. Anywhere between 4 and 6 eggs a day. He's a short bloke. He's not big, but he's still having quite a few eggs for his size and all that. So he's doing that as well. And on top of that, he's having about 2 grams per kilo body weight in terms of protein. He's having MSM, which is really good as a sulfur. He's also about 2 grams of that. He's having 6 grams of taurine, which is also good for bones. It is, I just haven't made the video, but it is. He had leucine before because he was just not having enough, protein at the time. And pretty much his bone density has increased and his muscle density has increased. He also lifts these little weights nearly every day. He basically lifts them for about 15 odd minutes in the morning and in the evening. So he does that continuously, So I just told you to do once a day. He does it twice, and he's been doing it for some time. So he just ignored me. He said, well, why not do extra? So Because I actually asked him, I said, oh, okay, I thought that you were already doing it once a day. Okay, fair enough. So he's been doing those sort of things. On top of that, he was, taking vitamin D at 5,000 IUs. He gets some menaquinone from his diet through the cheese and the eggs and stuff like that. So he doesn't need a supplement. That's menaquinone 4, K2, for those who. So I had him on a supplement initially, but then later on I didn't bother because he's getting it enough for his diet as he started eating more animal foods. He's on a choline supplement as well. And things have really turned around. Even last time we scanned him, his kidney cancer had actually reduced and his kidneys had actually grown slightly. But that's what you expect. The more aminos you have, if you're not getting enough protein synthesis, that means the extra aminos, you know where they go? Actually, they actually go to grow bigger organs. That's what they do. So for older people to consume more protein, it's actually a good thing. If you don't use it, if you've got a threshold, like a leucine level of threshold, anything above that that's not used for protein synthesis will actually go to growing larger organs. So if you were to take out, there's another video I haven't made, I know I'm awful, aren't I? If you take out leucine and then you actually just give protein to somebody, they won't grow as big muscles or bones, but what they will grow is bigger organs. So that's what the research shows with the animal studies. So pretty much that's having some extra beyond the requirements for the musculoskeletal stuff. It's a good thing because a lot of older people have had a lot of atrophy, organ atrophy. That means they've got less capacity to basically detox and do things like that. Very important, or have strong, hearts to be able to do things. They've allowed things to atrophy. And so by putting in extra protein into an older person, what you're actually doing is you're actually providing those extra aminos for those other purposes as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of advantage in that regard. But in terms of Dad's musculoskeletal structure, not doing too bad for a 90-year-old, nearly 90-year-old, 88 and a half, considering he'll be 89 in January, which, is only about 6 months away, more or less. So, yeah. So then these crackpots tell us, eat plants. Can you imagine? I mean, Garth Davis walks out of a shower. And actually his ankle snaps walking out of a shower. And the guy's about in his 40s. And my old man's double his age. It tells you everything. So heed the warning. Do you want to be a vagoon who snaps, crackle, and pops their bones? Or do you want to be like my old man who gets by a vehicle, 4-wheel drive, and survives to tell the tale, severely bruised and in pain for about 2 weeks, quite a lot of bruising. He struggled to be able to sleep. That was one thing. So he did suffer a lot of bruising all over. Well, soft tissue, I mean, I don't care what diet you're on, soft tissue, having a collision with a vehicle. Yeah. But the shocking part was that he had no broken bones. I'm just sitting there shaking my head. And so was the doctor. And then I told her exactly that he's been eating more protein and all that. And she goes, oh, that probably helps. Like a cognitive dissonance, completely cognitive dissonance. You can see it there. It's just, ooh. She looked at Dad. It was like, what the effing, is this situation? She just could not believe it. It was really funny. As I did tell her that before he was on 3 days on BPC 157. That's because he had a bad knee from when he was young, when he fell off the second floor and crushed his knee, and sort of they sort of set it together. They didn't set it properly, and he always had a bit of a problem knee that just got worse with age. But That's just, back then, backyard sort of, podiatry in the village. What did you expect? So, yeah, but beyond that, and I thought, oh, look, I'll give him BPC 157. He had been taking it for about 3 days. Now, obviously, 3 days is going to basically give you super strong bones or anything like that whatsoever. But maybe, it had an effect by the time, that he had a bit better protection. I don't know. I'm not putting it down. I don't believe, getting knocked like that, 3 days, not going to make much of a difference. After you've actually sustained something, then it can be useful for healing. But yeah, so I've kept him on it generally because we still have that bad knee to sort out. And that's still bad. It hasn't been, So the conclusion was from the actual doctor that the reason why they misdiagnosed was because he's got a bit of arthritic, and he's had that in his joints for a while. And she thinks that as he hit the pavement, some of those arthritic arthritis in the joints sort of shattered a bit and sort of spread, and sort of when they were doing the X-ray, it sort of created a bit of a sort of like a white streak or whatever. But when she looked at it carefully, she realized it was because she was more experienced. These the people in the hospital, they were, let's say, we didn't get the best doctors. We got the ones that were sort of younger and newer, so less experienced. And I think that's really what the problem was. And because they put the more experienced doctors in emergency to deal with the more critical patients, which really need experienced people. Understandable. I mean, he wasn't in any danger because they assessed him. The funny thing was, God, I mean, the health system has gone really to buggery. Really, I mean, it's really gone to buggery. I mean, from what I remember last time I was there, it's really understaffed. Maybe a lot of doctors and nurses resigned due to the COVID nonsense, possibly, because they said they've got far less doctors and nurses, and that was the problem. And now they've actually got a section inside the hospital that the emergency services people, the ambulance staff, they're actually there providing hospitalization service because the hospital can't. So Dad was actually in the actual that area, never was part of the hospital. He was there, taken to be X-rayed and having an MRI on his neck because he had a bit of soreness in his neck. He still does. It's more what has happened to Dad. More it's ligaments. So they've been stretched, pulled, the actual ligaments, and he's got a bit of inflammation, and also he's been battered and all that, but no broken bones. So it was just being battered. It'd be like a wild animal hitting an old person and just knocking them around all over the place in the past, in our tribal days, and being battered and being like that. It's going to take you a while to recover, at least a month or two. That's just normal. So his mobility is slightly reduced in that regard. So those are the sort of things, and sort of the doing the plaster thing atrophied that whole hand in 6 days. I couldn't believe it, how quickly you can atrophy. It was just shocking. He's just recently got back into exercising. That's why I'm helping him out at home, because he's still not up to 100% in his mobility or 100% in his strength within his hand. He's sort of doing a few exercises trying to get the strength back. So he's struggling in doing domestics and stuff like that. So I'm sort of being on carer's leave and on working from home and stuff like that to look after him. So, but I mean, he's 90 years old dearly, so it's going to take a few months to recover. But it could have been worse had he had broken, a number of bones or fractured a number of bones and all that. He would have been potentially still hospitalized. He would have been in a real bad state. But here he is, out of emergency, and then a week later getting his plaster off and getting discharged by the podiatrist. So he's completely out of the system after just, less than a week. It's just shocking. I mean, they can't even believe it. It's just shocking. Even his GP can't believe it. He's just sort of scratching his head. But he knows me quite well, and he knows that I've, made sure that Dad did a number of things supplemental wise and food wise to look after himself, because he's, he puts a lot of clothing on. He's indoors most of the time, and even in summer, he's not out sunbaking or anything like that. Out in the garden a bit in the morning, in the afternoon when it's not as hot. But, so he doesn't get sufficient vitamin D. So I've had him on supplements. Usually in the summer, I take him off the supplements, but the rest of the year, because it's Tasmania after all, 40 degrees south, we don't get, so spring, autumn, and winter, he's always on 5,000 IUs. In summer, he's off the vitamins, so he's only off for about 3+ months. For about 9 months, he's on 5,000 IUs, and he's getting sufficient calcium in his diet because he's got similar genetics to me. And yeah, it's made a big bloody difference, guys. A big bloody difference, and it sort of has made it, in my own head, it's I'm now far more convinced about the importance of protein than I was before. Seeing some other people in both our community and outside our community who have had injuries and stuff like that. And then my old man, who's much older than them, has had injuries and actually lived to tell the tale far better than others. I don't think there are many carnivores out there that I know that have been hit by a vehicle and have sustained only bruising and, ligament types things, but nothing severe like breaking bones or fractures. So I think people that poo-poo getting more protein, well over 2 grams per kilo body weight, well, I say to them, it's your business, do as you like. But as far as I'm concerned, I think that the minimum that people should be on is at least around 2 grams per kilo body weight. If you're doing a lot of physical activity, like I'm not, and that's why I'm at about 2 to 2.2. I only do a bit of occasional, once a week I do weightlifting. Outside that, I don't do any. So I just stick to about 2.2 grams per kilo body weight. And if somebody's doing more, they should be doing about 3. And if they're doing quite a lot, like competition level or stuff like that, they should be doing 4. And so, that's my personal opinion. And as they say, the proof is in the pudding. So I've, shown me another person that's nearly 90 years old that comes out of, an accident pretty much unscathed in terms of the skeletal stuff. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. So pretty much these are the sort of arguments we should point to these crackpots that they don't know what they're talking about. It's just nonsense on steroids. And we should basically, what is my opinion to this nonsense from the current academia in the nutritional field? Well, that's what I think of them. Not much at all. Anyway, guys, see yous.